The nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The Abyss. October 1934. The Reich Harvest Festival at Bückeberg near Hamelin. A gigantic display of what the Nazis called the national community. Almost 1 million people have come from throughout Germany to experience Adolf Hitler at first hand.
It was a huge event, bigger than anything ever seen before. All these people all see each other, and they're intoxicated by their very numbers.
It's a good feeling. You're all in it together. You talk to neighbors you wouldn't normally talk to at all, a bit like a big rock concert.
Some visitors mount mirrors on sticks to get a better view of Hitler. The enthusiasm on their faces is real. The regime has broad support among the people.
The festival has been organized so that the propaganda machine will have pictures showing Hitler with these huge crowds in front of him. And at the same time, they'll show how deeply moved he is by the great enthusiasm of these country people.
Hitler's speech is broadcast on the radio. Even with the newest loudspeaker systems, only a part of Hitler's words reaches the expectant crowd on the Bückeberg itself.
Wo ist es möglich, dass Volk und Führung in solcher Art ineinander übergehen und neben und beieinander stehen? Die Feier! Die Feier!
It was a piece of total theater. Technically, they probably couldn't have done it any better.
Mid-1930s Berlin. A year and a half after the takeover, the Nazis' hold on power is complete. Leftists, liberals, and dissidents are in prison or in concentration camps. There is no longer any opposition to speak of. The absolute power of the NSDAP is undisputed. In June 1934, an American sociologist visits Berlin. Columbia University's Theodore Abel wants to find out why NSDAP members joined the party. Goebbels supports Abel's work. The regime is confident enough to want to show Americans why it's a good idea to be a Nazi.
I think Goebbels saw an opportunity for a propaganda coup by giving the American public a particular view of the party, and that he really thought this could help our international image. And if we show that we're letting them do this with no restrictions, then it's also a sign that we're not living in such a terrible dictatorship.
Almost 700 biographies of party members, men and women, are analyzed. Overwhelmingly, their motivation is admiration for Hitler and hatred for the Jews.
With these people, it doesn't seem as though their anti-Semitism was awakened by Hitler or the NSDAP, but that it was already there. Many write that they got it from home, from their father or their grandfather or their brother or their friends. One writes, "I had always had a deep hatred for the Jews."
One complains about the contamination of the army by Jewish Marxists. and another about the Jew's role in the economy and in society. Wherever you looked, the Jew was running things. A year and a half earlier, on April the 1st, 1933, anti-Semitism had already led to open violence, but on that occasion, many ignored the SA's call to boycott Jewish businesses. Since then, the Nazis have refrained from public actions against Jews.
The great enemies were the communists, whether they were Jewish or not, and the socialists. So the Jewish question wasn't the priority. So even Jews thought, whatever's coming probably won't be so bad.
In Bremen, Walter Hachenburg hopes exactly that. He manufactures signs of all kinds. It's a flourishing business. He has an artistic bent and an expensive hobby few can afford in these times. He makes films, first in black and white, later in color, usually playing the lead himself. Walter Hachenburg is a cheerful soul, up for fun of all kinds. But he has a reflective side too, and he's worried about growing anti-Semitism in Germany. Especially for his father. Joseph Hachenburg, seen here with his son in 1928, can look back on more than 2 centuries of German Jewish family history that began in the town of Hachenburg in the Westerwald. Joseph is a patriotic German who served in the First World War. In 1917, his 19-year-old son Walter also volunteered.
When you risk your life for your country, it creates a deeper bond. And I think that also explains the shock many Jewish soldiers felt in the First World War, when there was a census of Jews in the army to see if enough were serving. And many Jewish soldiers felt stigmatized by that. I think that was a terrible experience for them.
Willi Cohn from Breslau was also a frontline soldier in the World War, and he is a practicing Jew. After Hitler's rise to power, he deliberately wears the ribbon of his Iron Cross in his lapel. In 1933, Cohn is a high school teacher. Then, as a Social Democrat and a Jew, he's dismissed.
Oh yes, these are wonderful times in Hitler's Germany,
he writes in his diary. After his dismissal, Willi Cohn spends a lot of time in a friend's garden, thinking hard about emigrating. He decides against it. Walter Hachenburg was christened and raised as a Protestant. He feels no link to Judaism, and he hopes that the anti-Semitism of the Nazis will pass him by.
Jews were highly assimilated since emancipation. Many of them had converted to Christianity, they'd intermarried, they'd just become integrated, acculturated, assimilated, integrated, whichever way you look at it. German Jews were part of the German nation and saw themselves in that way.
Walter Hachenburg sees himself as a German Protestant, but to the Nazis, his Jewish father makes him a so-called half-Jew, and thus automatically a second-class person. The Gloria Palast on Berlin's Kurfürstendamm. Germany's cinemas are enjoying a boom. September 1934, the comedy Heinz in the Moon with Heinz Rühmann is released. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels promotes apolitical entertainment. It works. Cinema audiences grow along with public support for the Nazi regime. But 1 year later, the Gloria Palast shows Pettersson and Bendel. This Swedish film leads directly to violence against Jews. It shows Bendel, a Jew, involving the unemployed Swede Pettersson in shady deals.
Und jetzt rufe ich diesen Herrn Griesberg an. Gib mir mal die Nummer.
Da unten steht's.
Goebbels personally approves the film for exhibition.
Zum Einreiben, dass die Haare wachsen soll.
The film draws on malicious anti-Semitic stereotypes. Bendel is portrayed as both devious and avaricious.
Afras Schönheitsmittel klingt besser. Damit machen wir mehr Geld.
Anti-Semitism wasn't unique to Germany in those days. There was anti-Semitism in France. There was anti-Semitism in Sweden and in the Soviet Union too. When they brought that film out, they didn't know what kind of an effect it would have.
The New York Times writes that after the premiere, SA thugs randomly attacked Jews along Berlin's Kurfürstendamm. Times reporter Varian Fry describes seeing a man lying on the sidewalk being kicked and spat on.
In 1935, there'd been a lot of unrest among party radicals. There'd been quite a lot of political activism, Nazi radicals wanting to beat up Jews on the streets. We have some well-known incidents here in Berlin on the Kurfürstendamm. And many ordinary Germans do not like that. Hitler, as usual, is very concerned about his reputation among the wider German public, wants to tone it down in some way, but also wants to regularise things in some way. So there's been quite a long discussion about what to do.
Hitler knows the time is not yet ripe for open violence. The White House, Easter 1935. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in office for 2 years now, has a special relationship to Germany.
Roosevelt had spent some time in Germany in his youth. He had a copy of Mein Kampf, unexpurgated edition, which he had, it's still in the library, in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. And Roosevelt had a pretty keen sense of what was going on.
Roosevelt does not take a position on German anti-Semitic violence right away. He has to consider the mood at home.
Governments don't act out of morality and for humanitarian reasons, as we can still see today. They act out of political and economic pragmatism, and fundamentally always for reasons of internal politics. In the USA, the economic crisis had led to a serious social crisis with millions of unemployed, and Roosevelt was in the process of introducing new social policies with the New Deal, so he was under real pressure domestically, and events in Germany were certainly not the top priority, beyond, of course, the normal questions of foreign policy.
Here, in New York's Madison Square Garden, Jewish organizations repeatedly call for resistance to the intimidation and violence reported from Nazi Germany. America is profoundly split in the 1930s. At one meeting, 20,000 people gather at the garden to call for a trade boycott against the Nazi regime.
To shape and to transform our present world.
On another occasion, 20,000 American Nazis meet at the same venue, financed by the NSDAP. This is Nazi Germany's attempt to influence opinion in the USA and to reinforce already existing anti-Semitism. Suddenly, a protester invades the stage. Security men deliver a brutal beating. America is the great hope for Jews now fleeing Germany in their tens of thousands. But Washington has no intention of relaxing entry conditions or raising the quotas.
Der Kongress
Congress and the general population were clearly against immigration, especially Jewish immigration. Anti-Semitism was rampant. Roosevelt had to be careful not to overdo it. He wanted to be re-elected. If he spoke out too openly for the Jews, that wouldn't happen.
Anyone who's allowed in at New York has hit the jackpot. In 1933 and 1934, the numbers of refugees are growing fast. About 60,000 of more than 500,000 German Jews flee to countries that will take them, including America and Palestine. The Promised Land. This film, made by a Zionist organization, wants German Jews to emigrate to Palestine. Willi Kohn watches it in Breslau. He writes in his diary,
"Yesterday's film was a really great experience. I could see the place where my son is working and is happy."
Ernst Abraham Kohn, seen here with his grandmother, has just emigrated to Palestine. The last photo, taken before he left, shows him with his half-sisters Ruth and Susanna, from Kohn's second marriage. His father wonders if the rest of the family should follow. But the prospects of finding work in Palestine are not good. Conflict is growing with the Arab population. From the mid-1930s, the flow of immigrants dwindles, mainly because officials of the British Mandate are enforcing strict limits on immigration. When luxury liners from Germany arrive in New York with tourists, there are violent demonstrations in the port against the Nazi regime. On July the 26th, 1935, an incident takes place on the liner Bremen that will have serious repercussions. The Bremen has recently held the Blue Ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. It's the pride and joy of the new Germany.
Certainly the Bremen liner was opened for public visitation, and the wharf in New York, really, if nothing else, other than to show off the beauties of German engineering to the New York public. It attracted, however, also rioters. According to the New York police, at least, the communists dominated among the rioters. Some of the rioters in particular managed to climb aboard, rip the swastika flag off its pole on board and throw it into the Hudson River.
William Bailey is the leader of a group of communist longshoremen and seamen.
And I thought it was almost home free. All I had to do was give it another yank, but it would not give. And I gave it a third yank and a fourth yank and a fifth yank, and it would not give. And you believe in panicky, and here we had the job already done, and a son of a bitch of a swastika would not give. Give me the rope. Hold it still. And he took out a switchblade knife, and I heard click, click. Ving! And he let it go on that part of the halyard, and the flag is now home free. And it was, believe me, it was a moment void. Everything that ever happened there was just to see that son of a bitch just flutter.
The NYPD arrest Bailey and his friends. There are fierce protests in front of the police station. For days, the newspapers are full of the story. Berlin is outraged and demands an apology from the US government. This is international news. French weekly Le Pèlerin praises the action as the first sign of American opposition to Hitler's dictatorship.
The Roosevelt government at the time was very eager to maintain friendly relations with the Third Reich, found the incident embarrassing, and did its best to assuage Nazi concerns.
But the diplomatic crisis between Washington and Berlin has only just begun. At the beginning of September, the presiding judge, Louis Brodsky, frees Bailey and the others. Brodsky is Jewish, and his justification for the decision is an unusual one.
He denounced the swastika as a black flag of piracy and, entirely justifiably, denounced the Nazi regime as barbaric. That I admire Judge Brodsky for doing it, but I must recognize that his use of his authority was not fully justified under the law.
Goebbels writes in his diary,
Judge insults the German national flag. I set the press onto it.
Is the pride of the German merchant fleet a pirate ship? By the time Hitler lands in Nuremberg for the party rally just days after Bailey and his friends are released, the regime has stoked the incident into a full-blown diplomatic row.
The episode on the Bremen with the flag was of course very convenient for the Nazis. It helped them win support for their racist and anti-Jewish laws.
At short notice, Hitler orders members of the Reichstag to gather in Nuremberg. They must pass new laws on the spot.
Reichs- und Nationalflagge ist die Hakenkreuzflagge, sie ist zugleich Handelsflagge.
The Roosevelt administration sent a formal letter of apology on the day that the Nuremberg laws were promulgated. And Hitler referred to the American formal letter, the telegraph of apology, in his speech at the time, expressing his gratitude for the fact that the Roosevelt administration had reacted in an honorable way.
Roosevelt's apology is a propaganda coup for the Nazis.
The Bremen incident created the opportunity for a piece of dramatic political theater on the international stage. The Nazis were always looking for opportunities to create moments of political theater. But there could hardly be any doubt that the laws would have been promulgated regardless.
Bailey and his fellow campaigners are hailed as heroes at Madison Square Garden. At last, Americans have stood up to the Germans. In 1936, Bailey volunteers along with 2,800 other Americans to fight for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War against Franco and Hitler. At the 1935 Nuremberg rally, the Nazis passed legislation that deprives Jews of their citizenship, as well as the Law for the Protection of German Blood, which bans marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews.
Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten. Unser Führer, dem Retter und Schöpfer, sie.
And these very, very clearly legally define the difference between those who are held to be German citizens and those who are merely subjects, the Jews. They are excluded.
The Nuremberg race laws affect Willy Cohn and his wife as they do all German Jews. The land they love is progressively disenfranchising them and their children. Cohn writes of his resigned despair.
You can see a lot of people feeling increasingly resigned and apathetic and, well, it's no point fighting anymore. There's nothing we can do about it. If in 1933 you still thought this will be short-lived, we can change things, from 1935 onwards you begin to think, can't do anything anyway.
The basis for the Law for the Protection of German Blood is the Nazis' racial mania. They consider Jewish genetic heritage to be inferior. Any commingling with German blood, miscegenation, will be severely punished. National Socialist politicians point to the American South. There too, the races are separated, civil rights are restricted, and interracial marriages banned to protect the purity of the white race. It's true that in 1935 there is strict segregation in the southern states. Mixed marriages are forbidden and many African Americans have no vote. But in the northeast, separation by race is illegal. In the rest of the country there's a degree of racial segregation, or simply no legislation on the subject.
The Nazis concluded, as one would expect Nazis to do, that the cause of America's rise to power lay in American racism.
The Nazi regime ignored the fierce battles fought by millions of Americans against racial segregation and choose only those examples that coincide with their ideology. Like the case of former heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, who fled to France when he was prosecuted for his relationships with white women. Were American racists the model for Hitler and the Nazis?
In spite of the fact that Hitler was pressurizing the responsible ministries to prepare this law at top speed, there was, of course, a background of preparation. National Socialist lawyers had discussed the subject from 1933 onwards, and they'd certainly taken into account what was happening abroad.
So the United States did indeed have an influence on the Nazi Nuremberg laws. This is a very uncomfortable matter for Americans. 30 of the 48 American states had what in the American tradition are called anti-miscegenation laws, that is, laws against race mixing. And they did serve as a direct inspiration to that aspect of the Nuremberg laws.
Of course, there were race laws in other parts of the world. But there was nothing so radical and so thorough and carrying such heavy penalties as in Nazi Germany.
Nazi propaganda made cynical use of the comparisons with the situation in other countries. It's perfectly true that racism wasn't invented by Germans or by the Third Reich. There was racism in other countries too, and in the United States it was completely out in the open. The Nazi government hoped that by making these comparisons, they would gain support and understanding abroad, as well as among the German population itself.
Hereditary defects. This Nazi propaganda film puts mentally and physically disabled people on show. In the Nazi view, it's not just non-Aryan elements that have to be removed from what they call the social body, but also its supposedly diseased limbs. Legislation passed in 1933 and 1935 allows people with a bad genetic inheritance to be sterilized. Few of them actually suffer from a hereditary condition. From 1933 onwards, people with psychological and nervous conditions are ruthlessly and systematically sterilized.
The victims were normal people. They were taken out of primary schools. They were taken out of the factories. Most were labeled mentally deficient. The next biggest category was schizophrenia. And in every case, they were forcibly sterilized.
Marie Lange is one of the victims. Married in 1931, she has one child. When the child is 3 years old, Marie begins to have panic attacks, becomes anxious and paranoid. She's admitted to a clinic where schizophrenia is diagnosed. The treatment? Marie Lange is sterilized. A few years ago in Erfurt, building workers removing a wall stumbled across files hidden for decades. The scale of Nazi forced sterilizations was to be kept secret forever. The regime is especially sensitive to extremely unfriendly publicity the policy has been attracting in the foreign press.
The directive came from Hitler, from the very top. No more figures must be published. They still kept a secret file with fairly exact records, at least until 1937, but the figures were no longer published.
The numbers of forced sterilizations increased rapidly in the early years of Hitler's rule, and then declined slightly up to the outbreak of war. In total, about 290,000 people are forcibly sterilized in just 6 years. The Nazis also sterilize almost 400 children born from relationships between German women and French occupation troops. The children are perfectly healthy, but they don't fit the Nazi ideal of the white, supposedly Nordic race.
Das war irgendwie eine sichtbare Schande.
There was a conspicuous, in inverted commas, defilement of the German people. And they tried to minimize the damage by sterilizing these people of mixed race, that they called Rhineland bastards. That happened extra-legally, under the direction of Eugen Fischer.
Unter Anleitung von Eugen Fischer.
Professor Eugen Fischer, head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology in Berlin, was Hitler's leading race scientist. He and his fanatical colleagues provided the pseudo-scientific arguments to support the Nazis' racial mania.
The logic of National Socialism and the racial hierarchy it believes in certainly contained the seeds of a violent conclusion.
Fischer's colleagues make pitiless judgments, life-changing decisions about human destinies, and they look so full of fun as they move the Institute's library. Among them is a man whose name one day will spread terror and fear: Joseph Mengele. As one of the most monstrous medical men in history, Mengele will carry out terrible experiments on twins in Auschwitz. This is Nazi Germany in the mid-1930s. Young and old are united under the Braun regime. No one is allowed to extricate themselves from the system, aligned only with party and Führer. Uniformity is the first duty of citizenship. In 1937, the German Workers' Front, with 18 million members, is the biggest German mass organization. Next comes the Hitler Youth, with 7 million members. The Nazi Party itself with 4.4 million members, and then the League of German Girls with 1.2 million. Since the seizure of power, the NSDAP has integrated every social group into national umbrella organizations. Swimming against the tide is a great evil in this national community. At elections and referendums, the regime receives near unanimous approval. But is the population really as loyal as the regime would wish? To find out, the Nazis commissioned secret reports on the public mood.
These reports are, of course, politically influenced, but all in all, we're pretty well informed about the way public opinion develops. And it turns out that the German people increasingly come to terms with the regime over the 1930s.
Walter Hachenberg has come to terms. He's divorced and has fallen in love with a woman 15 years younger. Here he is on a carefree seaside holiday with his girlfriend and his son. And yet, as a half-Jew, he's already threatened by the very people whose flag he's hoisting on the beach.
If you want to understand this behavior, there are two things to remember. On the one hand, and this applies to everyone, the desire to belong is extremely powerful. The other is that many of the NSDAP's goals were also shared by the middle classes, like being proud of Germany and Germany's renewed greatness. Those were widely held values.
Germany's Jews are increasingly and systematically ostracized. They encounter very little sympathy.
I cut off the foreign group exclude them from the community, from our common humanity. I take away their individuality and turn them into an anonymous, inhuman band. Awful to say it, but basically they're being hunted.
Jews are rejected everywhere. Why don't they go to Palestine? The display cases of the Nazi weekly Der Stürmer function like a public pillory.
There were columns, headings, where these display cases were, where they would write and add photos, saying who was going into Jewish shops, or what the only Jew in the village was doing. And that led directly to an atmosphere of fear, denunciation, and backstabbing.
New York. Once again, tens of thousands demonstrate against the Hitler regime and demand a trade embargo against Nazi Germany. They insist the United States must pull out of the upcoming Olympics in Berlin. Boycotting the Games would be a serious blow to Hitler. But the Americans are there when the Games are opened on August the 1st, 1936.
He arrived to declare the Games open, accompanied by his staff at the head of each column. 30,000 pigeons were released to make a spectacle in the sky and tell the world that the Games were on.
The regime has announced that a German Jewish sportswoman will represent her country, Gretel Bergmann.
Allowing a Jewess to appear was too much for Hitler and for the German sports authorities. And so at the last minute, they found a way to exclude her. With the US team already on its way across the Atlantic, they announced that Gretel Bergmann would not appear, owing to underperformance, in spite of the fact that she had just equaled the German high jump record.
The Olympic Games are a great success for Hitler.
Nella prima frazione recupera metro per metro. È già sull'olandese e sulla canadese all'esterno, poi le passa.
The Olympic Games delayed the start of the Second World War. The Games were such powerful international propaganda for Germany, it now seemed far less urgent to oppose Germany from abroad. The Olympic Games played an extremely important role in the success of German diplomacy and German foreign policy between 1936 and 1939.
Don't trust a fox on a green sward, and don't trust a Jew to keep his word. After the Olympic Games are over, hatred of the Jews in Germany reaches a new peak. Children's books and a board game with anti-Semitic stereotypes appear on the market. The message? Jews out.
We can see that a new phase of the persecution of the Jews starts after the Olympic Games. That is, the Nazis could step up the boycotts, the Aryanizations, the attacks on the Jews, and also the attempts to make them leave Germany.
In the White House in Washington, concern is growing for Germany's Jews. In November 1936, Roosevelt is re-elected, but America's borders are still largely closed to Jewish refugees. It'll be another 1.5 years before Roosevelt acts. On July the 6th, 1938, after Germany has absorbed Austria, and with pressure mounting on Austria's Jews to leave, diplomats from around the world meet in the French spa town of Evian. Their governments are to agree to take in more Jewish refugees. That's Roosevelt's plan. But the conference fails.
Roosevelt understood what was going on, but the opposition in America was too strong.
Of course, the USA had its quotas, and they could have been more generous. But the humanitarian disaster and the humanitarian failure that went with it, that was the same in every country.
Jewish refugees don't seem to be welcome anywhere.
הוועידה של אביאן הוכיחה לעולם, הוכיחה ליהודים.
After the Evian conference, it was clear to the world, to the Jews, and above all to Germany, that there was no desire to help the Jews.
של מוכנות לעזרה ליהודים. זה היה סימן בשביל...
For Hitler's policies, that was a sign he could operate freely, without having to worry about a negative reaction from the global community, because they had already shown they were indifferent to the fate of the Jews.
העולם כבר הוכיח שהוא אדיש לגורל של היהודים.
The next move against Germany's remaining Jews comes in October 1938. Their passports are stamped with a red J, the forerunner to the Yellow Star. Soon after, Hitler and Goebbels used the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris to unleash a campaign of brutal violence.
The burning of synagogues through the night of 9th to the 10th of November, the smashing of Jewish shops and businesses and homes. This is a wave of violence across Germany. November 38 is a really crucial turning point.
1,400 synagogues and temples are destroyed or badly damaged in fires started by the SS and the SA. 1,300 people die, either killed outright or as a consequence of their violent treatment.
The SA and the SS didn't just throw rocks at windows. They broke into people's apartments and destroyed everything. And of course, they didn't hold back from beating up the people in those apartments. Men and women, young and old, children, throwing them downstairs, kicking them in the stomach. This was a degree of violence that hadn't been seen before, and it went so far beyond what we think of as civilized behavior that for many people it was the abyss.
Thousands of Jewish men are taken from their homes. They're made to gather at collection points to be transported to concentration camps. It all happens in plain sight.
30,000 Jewish men, Jewish adult males, were arrested, marched off to concentration camps, and very often as they were marched down the road there were crowds on either side, jeering, waving, laughing.
The day of the pogrom, Willie Cohn's eldest daughter Ruth celebrates her 15th birthday. She's scared and wants to leave Germany as soon as possible. Her older brother Wolfgang, who emigrated in 1933, encourages her. But her father wants to stay. He confides to his diary,
"In spite of everything, I am attached to Germany."
After the November pogrom, the second most powerful man in the Reich takes control of state violence against the Jews. Hermann Göring announces the new measures in the ceremonial hall of the Reich Air Ministry.
Göring
says more or less this: the pogrom was not the solution. A pogrom cannot be the solution. From now on, we are getting to work properly. The result will be a Germany that is free of Jews. What that means is that following this session, the solution to the Jewish problem has become more radical than ever before.
More harassment follows. No cars, no walking in the park, no sitting on benches. Jewish school children, the ones that are still at normal schools, have to leave those schools, and people who managed to emigrate before the outbreak of war are robbed of almost all their money and property.
The night of the pogrom persuades many Jews who until then had been in two minds that it's time to escape. Their destinations of choice are ever further from Europe. But emigrating to America now becomes even harder.
They had to have a guarantor to prove that they wouldn't be a burden on the state. But since many of them didn't even start making plans to emigrate until after the November pogrom in 1938, they didn't have time to emigrate to America before the outbreak of war in 1939. So in fact, the US immigration quotas for German and Austrian Jews remained unfilled.
As the Kohns despair in the weeks after the pogrom, Walter Hachenburg marries his fiancée in Bremen Cathedral. Afterwards, there's a magnificent reception. Hachenburg is baptized as a Protestant, yet in the inhuman jargon of the Nazis, he is a half-Jew. But he refuses to admit that he's in danger.
Sometimes we're very, very bad at coping with brutal situations. And one way we cope is by not thinking about them. If we could talk to people today about the way things were then, I think they'd say, somehow we knew, but I like to keep things simple, so I ignore all the evidence that should have made it obvious that things can only get worse.
6 weeks later, Joseph Hachenburg, Walter's Jewish father, cuts his own throat. After the November pogrom, he had fallen into a deep depression.
Those persecuted Jews who committed suicide thought, this can't really be happening. I know the Germans. I love this country, its writers and its composers. And in their despair, they took their own lives. There were thousands of them.
There was a wave of suicides after November 1938, and then all the way to the deportations. And you have to add to that the many people who took overdoses and survived, and were then deported from hospital.
May Day, 1939. Hitler has just turned 50 and is at the peak of his power. The majority of Germans support him.
It's important to remember that in free elections, only about a third of Germans had voted for Adolf Hitler, had voted for the Nazi Party. However, by the time of his 50th birthday in 1939, Hitler's popularity was far greater. Adolf Hitler was seen as the guy who at least for some, was maybe a bit extreme and maybe did things that not everyone approved of. But people said, well, but at the end of the day, he's still getting things done.
In May 1939, the Hachenburgs leave on their American honeymoon. Many of the other passengers are Jews who have secured one of the rare entry visas. In New York, they take a sightseeing tour. There are threatening headlines. Is Germany planning another war? At exactly the same time, 2,000 kilometers away, the passenger ship St. Louis sails into Havana harbor. It has more than 900 Jews on board. They've come from Hamburg. The Cuban government refuses to recognize their immigration papers. After days of fruitless negotiation, the St. Louis departs. Then, both the USA and Canada turn the refugees away. The odyssey finally ends in Antwerp in Belgium. There the Jews can disembark. But when the war starts, most of them will once again fall into the hands of the Nazis. In the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Hitler is completing top-secret plans for the attack on Poland. German mobilization is imminent. Walter Hachenburg was a sergeant in the First World War. On his return from honeymoon, he reports to his barracks. He wants to fight for Germany again and sets to work on the home front. His son serves in the Hitler Youth, putting up signs for air raid shelters. 4 weeks later, Walter Hachenburg is a civilian again. shaking a collection cup for the Winter Aid campaign. The Wehrmacht doesn't want a half-Jew as an NCO, even if he sees himself as a Christian. His self-image as a Protestant doesn't protect him for much longer. In 1944, there's a visit from the Gestapo. Walter Hachenburg is taken to Bremen-Fager concentration camp. He survives the concentration camp and the war. But he's a broken man.
He was lucky, because most of those classified as half-Jews had rather poor chances of survival. And those chances got worse as time went on, because the conditions in the camps got worse. And in that sense, he was really lucky to survive.
In November 1941, 53-year-old Willy Cohn and his 40-year-old wife Gertrude are deported from Breslau with their daughters Susanna 9 and Tamara 3. Their oldest daughter Ruth has fled to Denmark, and from there she has made it to Palestine. Her parents and sisters ride to their death in freight trains. The Cohn family share the fate of millions of European Jews. Cattle wagons of the German Reichsbahn transport them to occupied Lithuania. There they are led to pits where shootings have been taking place for months. On November the 29th, 1941, rifle bullets end the lives of the Cohn family. The genocide is well underway and will continue for more than 3 years in German death camps. But the Holocaust really began back in the 1930s, with marginalization, the deprivation of rights, and physical violence.